What if part of the quiet discomfort some people feel comes from the realization that they've become someone too far away from themselves? There's a kind of discomfort that doesn't make noise. And at first, it doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it just feels like exhaustion or disconnection, like something inside you has slowly started fading away. It doesn't arrive as some huge event. It doesn't feel like a crisis. It shows up quietly, in repetition, in identical days, in automatic responses. In the feeling of living a life that works on the outside, but no longer connects with something deeper inside you. And maybe the scariest part is that many people live like this for years, without realizing it. How often have you truly stopped to think about who you've become? Not who you appear to be, not the social character, and not the personality you learned to maintain around other people, but who you've actually become. Because many times personality functions almost like a costume, a psychological outfit worn so many times that it no longer feels like a choice. And little by little, we start defining ourselves through our own patterns. This is just who I am, that's how I've always been, as if repeated behavior were identity. Maybe part of what we call personality is actually adaptation. Behavioral patterns, emotional mechanisms, automatic responses. Strategies created to survive environments, relationships, fears, and experiences. And after enough time, those strategies begin to feel like who we are. Routine helps with that. Days begin repeating themselves almost mechanically. Like a train locked onto fixed tracks. You already know where it leaves from, and you know where it's going. And slowly life becomes too predictable. The same conversations, the same thoughts, the same reactions, the same emotional cycles. Everything begins running on autopilot. And maybe that's why some people feel like they're becoming less alive. Because there's a difference between functioning and truly being alive. You probably know someone like this, maybe a family member, who reacts the exact same way at every family gathering. The same defensiveness, the same emotional outbursts, the same triggers. Or a boss who loses emotional control one day and then tries to compensate the next with compliments and quiet kindness. Or even people who completely change depending on who's in the room, as if there were never a stable self, only versions, adapted for social survival. Over time, these people become predictable. And the strangest part is that, most of the time, they don't even notice it. Because the brain loves automatism, it loves saving energy. It loves turning patterns into identity. It feels comfortable, even when it hurts. And maybe that's one of the most dangerous parts of unconscious living. It can be painful and familiar at the same time. The frustration is real, the emptiness is real, and the suffering is real. But everything happens inside a familiar cycle. Until something starts breaking, and usually it doesn't happen beautifully. Awakening rarely begins with clarity. Most of the time, it begins when reality becomes too distant from what was once desired. When there's a quiet collision between who you became and who some part of you once dreamed of being. And maybe that's the moment when the pain finally appears honestly. Because while we're completely identified with the character, there's no distance large enough to observe. But when something begins waking up, you start looking at your own life, almost like an outside observer. And then you notice the cycles, the repetitions, the inherited behaviors, the automatic reactions, the versions of yourself built over time. And maybe you realize something even harder. That part of your life was built trying to keep a character alive, even if that character was pulling you away from yourself. Maybe that's why so many people only change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. And then the symptoms begin. Something inside the person can no longer tolerate the old identity. They begin craving small ruptures, small differences, small movements. Like a new haircut, for instance, not because it changes a life, but because something inside has started rejecting automatic repetition. The person tries a new path, a different style of clothing, different music, a new coffee, a new way of speaking, a new way of existing. And from the outside, these changes seem small. But internally, something deep has begun moving. As if a forgotten part of the self were trying to emerge again. And maybe the strangest part is that this usually arrives first as a feeling. Before it becomes clarity, it becomes restlessness. Strange thoughts, unexpected desires, imagined futures, a nostalgia that's difficult to explain. A constant feeling that this can't be all there is. And maybe Plato was talking about exactly this in the Allegory of the Cave. The story of people sitting in darkness, watching shadows projected on a wall, and believing those shadows were reality. Maybe the cave wasn't only about intellectual knowledge, but about the moment someone realizes they've spent years staring at shadows, while something inside them has been searching for light. And maybe that's when they realize the reality they've been living may not be the whole reality. But leaving the cave requires effort. Because awakening isn't comfortable, there's insecurity, confusion, and internal disorder. Because now you're dealing with something unfamiliar, yourself. And maybe one of the hardest questions in life is, when does someone realize they betrayed themselves? Maybe it appears as sadness, maybe as emptiness, maybe as envy of other people's lives, maybe as nostalgia, maybe as the sudden urge to disappear for a few days. Or simply that quiet feeling that life has lost depth. And maybe the hardest part of awakening is realizing that it doesn't happen cleanly. Because when a character begins dying, the new self hasn't fully arrived yet. And for a while, you remain in between versions of yourself. There's a quiet grief in that. The grief of the identity you carried for years, the automatic responses, predictable behaviors. The way you learn to exist in order to be accepted, loved, tolerated, or understood. Because even when maintaining the character hurts, it still offers something dangerous. Familiarity. And abandoning what feels familiar, even when it hurts, is terrifying. Maybe that's why so many people prefer remaining numb, because awakening requires courage. Now you begin noticing patterns that once went unseen. You notice environments that drain your energy. Empty conversations, relationships sustained only by habit, versions of yourself that no longer feel true. And once you've seen it, it becomes difficult to unsee. Once you've seen reality outside the cave, there's no returning to what you once believed. There's also a quiet loneliness in this process. Because while one part of you awakens, other people still expect you to remain exactly who you've always been. The same character, the same responses, the same limitations, the same predictable versions. And for a while, they'll continue treating you that way. But in truth, that matters less and less, because something has already begun changing. And even without fully understanding what's happening, you feel it. You feel that some part of you can no longer return to complete sleep. You can no longer numb yourself the way you once did. Maybe that's what so many people call an identity crisis, but maybe some crises are only the beginning of a reunion. And there's something beautiful about that. Because when the character begins weakening, the essence begins speaking. And it speaks quietly, very quietly. While the character screams, while routine numbs and autopilot takes over, the essence whispers, and it takes sensitivity to hear it. That's why small changes matter so much. Not because of the changes themselves, but because they interrupt the trance and create space. Space to notice, to feel, space to exist less automatically, and slowly, new internal references begin forming. You no longer tolerate certain old situations, you can no longer ignore certain discomforts, and you can no longer pretend some parts of your life still make sense. Because something inside you has entered movement. And maybe that's exactly what the essence needs, movement. Not perfection, not absolute certainty, not instant transformation, but movement, learning, expansion, awareness. Maybe maturity is exactly this, stopping yourself from living only as an automatic reflection of what was done to you and beginning to live according to what you consciously choose to nourish within yourself. And somewhere in this process, you realize something important. You are not defined by every thought that passes through your mind. But there's a silent observer between you and your thoughts, a consciousness capable of noticing patterns, capable of observing emotions, of looking at yourself from the outside. And when that observer awakens, life begins gaining depth again, as if small pieces slowly begin fitting together. Experiences, wounds, mistakes, choices, people, losses, desires, all forming a larger mosaic. And maybe part of life is exactly this, learning to perceive the entire picture while still living inside it. The essence speaks quietly, the character speaks loudly. Routine numbs, but something inside you continues trying to emerge. And maybe true courage isn't becoming someone new, but finally having the courage to move closer to who you've always been.
If this reflection resonated with you, like and subscribe to The Arise. New reflections await.